All right. Good evening, wonderful, great, amazing people. 100 Roses members, 100 Roses program participants. Take two. We got some, I think we even got some growth initiative summer folks in here, but we definitely have our distinguished panelists as well. And definitely shout out to the entire Black History Month team. So like just props to them. This is our last installment of our Black History Month stuff. Then we'll move on to our Women's Heritage or History Month, whatever you want to call it. We're going to move on to that next month with some probably things at the end of the month because we're still trying to get all that together. But tonight we definitely wanted to put something together for you all that was impactful as always, something that is just incredibly important, an incredible topic to discuss, just due to the fact that this is how we create spaces for those that are uncelebrated. So that's why the whole topic of tonight is, celebrating the uncelebrated. So I just want everyone to, kind of listen, learn, and leverage everything that they're going to experience in this space. We are thankful to have you in this space with us tonight. And once again, thank you in advance to our distinguished panelists. Before we start K-Flex, I just want us to have like a brief moment of silence for all like the crazy things that are kind of going on in the world right now. So if we could just take like 10 seconds of straight silence, and then K-Flex is going to come in. But once again, thank y'all. So let's just take a brief 10 seconds, not 10 minutes, 10 seconds of silence, please. Thank you.
If it was muted when it go in.
All right, thank y'all. All right, K-Flex.
All right, y'all, thanks so much for joining us this evening. I know that it is late evening for some of you, and it is still daylight for some of us over on the West Coast. So whatever time it is, thanks for showing up on this last day of Black History Month. I should say this last official day of Black History Month. So as you've probably heard the phrases before, Black History Month isn't just for Black people. Every month is Black History Month. These are statements that are so unmistakably true that you can put them on a t-shirt. In fact, they are on t-shirts. And for as long as I can remember, every month has been Black History Month for me. And for an exceptional amount of that time, I prioritized, or rather, I chose my Blackness over my queer identity. There was a time before anyone would tell me that I didn't have to choose one identity over another, and those identities could intersect, they could support, and they could elevate each other. Today, we're here to celebrate the intersectionality between the queer and Black communities, to not just give respect to those that paved the way before the activists before us here today, but to hold space for the impact and influence Black culture has had on the queer experience and vice versa. When I use the word Black, I'm referring to those with African heritage living in America. I'll be using the term queer to refer to sexual orientation and those who identify as LGBTQIA+ for the purpose of today's discussion. You may hear some other terms come up that you aren't familiar with. Feel free to look them up on your own so we can keep the discussion moving. We're all on Zoom, so I know Google is right behind you. So before we start exploring the impact of queer experiences have on Black culture, we want to get to know each of our panelists and have them introduce themselves and tell us why this topic feels personal to you. Feel free to give us any highlights or however you want us to get to know you better. I'm Kristen, your moderator for this evening. My pronouns are she, her, hers. And I'm gonna double Dutch Adia in.
Thank you, Kristen. So as Kristen said, my name is Adia. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I identify as a lesbian. I'm also marrying my partner of almost 10 years next year, so that's exciting. Some more background information about me. I'm currently working in a compliance role at a nonprofit, but I've always been passionate about social policy and music. So I have 2 bachelor's degrees. One is in vocal performance and the other is in political science. I got both of those in 2018 from Salem College, which is a small women's college in North Carolina. And I'm currently in a master's of public policy program at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, and my concentration is in urban policy. So this topic is personal to me because, like Kristen was sharing, I feel like I've always really led with my Black identity. I went natural in 2009, like thousands of other Black girls did because of YouTube. And I'm dark skinned, so like I was teased a lot for how I looked. I was teased for having natural hair as a child and just my appearance. And so my response to that has been to like really just force myself to love myself and to embrace those things about myself. And I think because of that, I've always really led with my Black identity. But over the past maybe 2 to 3 years is something I realized is the privilege that I have as someone who to many people is straight passing. People don't usually know that I'm gay until they see me with my fiance, and even then they just think we're friends. I actually think I think we would have to like find a way to make it clear in public. I'll keep it PG, but for people to realize that we're together, even though we've been together for so long. So that combined with how difficult my coming out story in terms of coming out to my mother is really what made me kind of shy away from or suppress that identity as a queer woman as a way to protect myself in spaces outside of like my friends. While I can't as easily do the same with my Blackness. But as I get older and a little more sure of myself and just wanting to make sure I'm really loving myself and not having to convince myself to be proud of who I am, it just feels more and more important to lead with my queer identity and to be honest with myself about how it impacts my life, both professionally and personally.
Thanks, Cynthia. Really appreciate the vulnerability that you and all of us are going to indulge in today together. Teek, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Hi, thanks for having me. I'm Teek Milan, pronouns he, him. I'm a journalist, an advocate, writer. I'm a dad, a leadership and development coach. I do leadership and development coaching for managers and executives all over the world. I'm writing a book. I'm a Cancer, so I'm overly dramatic about things often. I'm also transgender, queer identified. So that's me. So why is this important to me? I think oftentimes when we talk about the Black experience, it's in this very kind of restrictive, kind of monolithic thing where Blackness only looks one way, where I'm Black and queer and trans, and I'm all of those things at the same time. I always like to say that we are layers, not fractions, and it's not fair to ask people to only bring a fraction of themselves into the room because it makes you feel better about your own biases, right? So I think it's important to have these layers, and I think, to understand that as Black people, when we're having discourse about the Black experience, because I think what's important is that Black people have to take that time to be more self-aware and also to be accountable in the ways in which we have taken away space from Black queer folks, right? I think a lot of times we have conversations about white folks, which is important. White folks need to be accountable to their bullshit too, but so do Black straight people within our community. So I think that, so there's a nuance there that I think is important. And to also talk about how my Blackness influences my queerness and vice versa is another thing that I'm really interested in. And then also as a Black queer man who comes from a very loving and accepting family that's very Black, working class Black folks from the Rust Belt, and sometimes they're a little confused about what to do with me, but they've always loved me and they've always been there for me. And I haven't had any problems at all. And I think too often when we have conversations about Black queer people, the center of it is the resilience against not being loved. This idea that, our families don't hate us or our communities hate us. And I think that sometimes that is true. And those stories are important. But also the Black queer experience can also be a love story. So there's that really interests me. And then the third thing that really interests me is I think that the experience of being trans and queer in the world is this experience of self-determination, and to be self-determined in your humanity. That blueprint does not just belong to trans and queer people alone, but I think that we are a blueprint to a better future. So that's part of the reason why I'm writing this book. Part of the reason why I do these things, because I want everybody to feel that they can be self-determined in their humanity. You can be whomever you want to be and however you want to be. That's just your path to your own greatness. So that's me.
That was quite an introduction. I really love the idea that we're celebrating those uncelebrated queer coming out stories of love, because you are correct. I feel like we don't hear them that often, and I know it's not because they don't exist. And yeah, I'm super excited to have you here, Teak. Noah, why don't you introduce yourself? Tell us who you are, why you be here, why you're interested in this topic.
Hi, everyone. I am Noah. My pronouns are they, them, theirs. In the daytime, Monday through Friday, 9 to 5, I am a tech recruiter. I work in tech, and a big part of my goal in life is to help people break into tech. I feel like it's a huge barrier, and it oftentimes can change Black folks' lives to be in tech and really move the needle on social mobility. So that's what I do. In other ways, I'm a writer, storyteller, poet. I am launching my own streetwear brand next year, so be on the lookout for that. And in terms of why I'm here and excited to be here, one, I love doing things with the Roses. I love all y'all. Y'all are the best. And in addition to that, I think it's probably twofold. One, I'm just passionate about education and kind of opening up the door, and kind of being a window for people to like peer in a safe way, both for myself and for those who are trying to learn. So that's my big reason, I think. And two, kind of what Teak was saying, I'm a big proponent of joy, and I feel like a lot of times messages around trans folks are just sad stories. And the history of trans folks, non-binary folks, queer folks, dating back to the ancestors of Black people, are full of stories of success and triumph and magic and transformation. So that's really what I want to bring to the table today, is a little bit of education, but a lot of bit of joy and resiliency and the power that we all harness as Black queer folks. So yeah, that's me.
Amazing. Well, we're all here to talk about some pretty important stuff. And I want to start off with acknowledging that this was one of the deadliest years on record for Black trans folks. And we've seen growing numbers of houselessness among Black queer young people and devastating laws that are threatening to pause a movement that has great momentum. I think as we look around and see who the pandemic has been cruel to, we see not only people that look like us, but people who have similar experiences and stories of and needs that we also have. So I'd love to hear from y'all, since we're here to celebrate, what are the victories of the last 5 or so years? And what do you think that Black queer folks have to celebrate, and how have those celebrations impacted your own experience? I'll start with you, Noah.
Great, yeah. I think this is a great question. I think there's been a lot to celebrate. And I think I kind of want to like approach it in a non-traditional way, only because I feel like a lot of times we talk about what's seen in the mainstream, right? Like Pose and all these documentaries and trans athletes, which are all huge, momentous occasions for everyone, including Black folks. But I think the biggest win that I've seen in the last 5 years is just people being allowed to be themselves. coming out and it not being a huge deal, being celebrated, being championed, people coming around to loving trans folks and not being afraid of loving trans folks, and trans folks being allowed to be in relationship and cultivating that both platonically and romantically. I think that we don't celebrate the small wins enough. And I think there's been like a lot of those just in terms of people gaining the language to describe themselves, being comfortable with describing themselves as queer or trans or non-binary or nothing at all or everything at the same time, and being able to do that while still being Black, I think is been the biggest win that I can really think of in the last 5 years.
Yes, for sure. I think being able to just do your thing and and be your authentic self, whether you are showing up in the media or you're showing up at a school dance or you're showing up for a job interview. These are really important moments. And I love what you said about loving instead of fearing trans people. I think that is such a huge win that I've seen in the last few years, and not even just a win that I've noticed in media, but a win I've noticed having worked on dating apps and having witnessed it in my own social circles of people looking at their own biases and being like, why aren't I dating anybody right now that is outside of what I have been told is appropriate for me? And I think that is such an exciting thing to see more people deserving of love and intimacy. Very exciting stuff. So Teek, tell me, what do you think is a victory in the last 5 years or so that has impacted your experience?
Yeah, I think similar to Noah, us having representation in mainstream media, I think is important. Even though I think sometimes that representation can sometimes be smaller than what our actual lives are. But I think the fact that there are Black trans and Black queer creators who are behind the camera is even more important than being in front of the camera, because we know how to tell our stories. When we can see the beauty and humanity of ourselves, then we can portray the beauty and humanity in ourselves, other than there's someone who sees us as an other or as like a performance or as like this or as someone who is just the sum of all of their tragedy, right? So I think that we have ways in which we can really tell our stories in really nuanced and complex ways. And now there's a couple things that happen here, right? So one, we have more Black and trans folks who are more visible. Therefore, we serve as like possibility models.
Good, how are you?
Trans folks, right? So now you have more people who are coming out, more people who have this identity. But as that's happening, we're seeing like a policy push against queer people in families, in education, in public spaces. And what they always say, if America catches the flu, then Black America catches pneumonia, something like that. You know what I'm saying? So it's like, and I mean that's a weird joke to make during COVID, but I'm saying all that to say, like, being that all of these things are happening against trans people, it's going to affect Black trans folks and Black queer folks even more. So there's kind of this paradox of us being visible and being out there, that there's going to be more people pressed up against making sure that we don't have the audacity to exist. But what I also do know is that we have to keep pushing for representation and more complicated and more joyous representation, because storytellers, we are the ones that change the culture. I used to be I was a senior strategist at GLAAD for a few years, and I was the head of their national news there. And so we look at the data, and what we saw was the more we were just talking about like gay and lesbian people, the more and more there were gay and lesbian people telling their stories in media. They saw a shift in people's ideas and perceptions around gay people, particularly around gay marriage and gay parenting. All of that started to increase as the storytelling increased. And that's what we need to see as well. I'm just thinking of it from a strategic standpoint. It's so important for us to get our stories out there in front of people, because the more people can see us as people, the more that's going to start to have that policy shift. So I think it hasn't been perfect the last 5 years, but I'm happy to see that we're more visible, and I know what this is going to turn into, what this can lead into later. But the more visible we are, the more pushback we're going to get. So the visibility and the advocacy pieces have to work hand in hand. But I think that people are doing good, but we can always do better.
Yeah, that's for sure. And it's interesting how that works, right? Where you get a little representation, you get a little something, and then an administration or a demographic or a school administration pushes back, and you know, and it's almost like, were you even thinking about us before that? Did you even? No, you weren't even thinking about us. Just go about your business, keep it moving. But that's not what happens. Dia, I would love to know some victories that you've seen, and how they might have impacted your experience.
So it's funny Noah brought up pose, because that's what I was thinking about. But I think that it's partially because of where I am, like just with my journey, with my identity. Pose, although there were definitely some aspects of the show where it focused on trauma. A lot of it was it's very celebratory. And that was the first time that's the first time that I can think of seeing trans women portrayed in a positive way in the mainstream media. So that was really powerful for me to see that. Especially as I was thinking about my own identity. So the biggest impact that show had on me was just how confident the characters were, how devoted they were to finding relationships where they could feel love without fear or having to hide themselves. How the characters and the actresses really just command a room and take up space, often appearingly without fear. And I think I kind of touched on this before, but I'm not exactly an extrovert. So when I'm very drawn to people who take up space in that way, because I'm not like that, although I sing and I'm fine with taking up space on stage, but not in like my personal life. It's weird. But yeah, some of my early coming out experiences have just impacted how I come out to people, which I do all the time because people think I'm straight when they meet me. And they usually assume I'm with a man if I say I'm engaged. So yeah, just seeing them be able to take up space and take care of each other, be in community with each other and love themselves was really refreshing for me to see and really important for me to see, just with, like I said, my identity journey, I guess.
Yeah, that's really cool. And I think that I think these victories are really important because I feel like in any movement, it's so easy to focus on the things that you don't have and the things that you're still fighting for than to think about the things that you just got and have that sort of that gratitude for your community, not gratitude towards like anything else, just like your community and like who you are and your identity, because these are things that we all deserve, is this like you know, these celebratory moments. So I'm curious to know what are some of the ways that the Black experience or that Black culture has directly influenced your queer experience. And I'll again use queer very loosely here. You know, you can get in the weeds with your answers, be as high level as you want here. I'd love to know what you're thinking, Adia.
How have my Black experiences impacted my queer experiences? What really comes to mind for me is a conversation that I had with a white professor I think this was like November, December. This is a professor I didn't particularly like, to be clear. I argue with him all the time. But in this particular conversation, I chose to present, I was presenting on, I forgot her name, but she calls herself a Black urbanist. She's also queer. And so I was just presenting like what her theories are when she was talking about housing and like urban policy. And I talked about the importance of like historical or cultural buildings in Black communities. And my professor's critique was, he said, well, you know, the Black community has been unkind to the queer community. Do you really think that a Black gay woman, queer woman would care about a church? And this is where me being straight passing really comes in, because I was like, well, sir, he said a young Black queer woman. I said, as a young Black queer woman, I will say, yes, I do care about the Black church in the community. So I think that's what it is for me, that a lot of the times, I mean, I obviously show up as Black, I can't deny that. But because people don't see me as queer unless I say it, sometimes people say like those, I mean, I don't know why he said that. I really couldn't tell you. I don't know how he's employed. But I think he felt more comfortable saying that because he thought that he knew more about my identity than I did. I don't know. I guess he thought that he could speak for a community that I'm a part of because he didn't know I was a part of the community. So that's like the biggest thing that stands out to me, I guess.
There's a lot of assumptions going on there. There's a lot of layers to that actually, and I'm just being careful of time here. So please, panelists, jump in if there's something that I don't ask you. I'm going to pivot because we've kind of hit a note that I want to explore with all of you, which is, you know, in the workplace or at school, it's not always safe for Black people to be Black and feel job security. Often there's this feeling of double jeopardy of feeling both discriminated against for being Black and either discriminated or, you know, silenced for being queer. And I'm wondering how or if and how you may have experienced this feeling of double jeopardy in school or your career. Cheek, what about you?
Yeah, I think, you know, I just recently started working for a company. I've been working as an independent advocate, and I was with Glad for a few years, but for like 5 years, I was just working independently. And a part of the reasons I had worked independently and have had so many shifts in my career is to avoid that. When I started out my career, when I moved to New York City 20 years ago, I wanted to be a music journalist. I was working in hip hop and I was doing it. Was very, very masculine, and people didn't know what to make of me when I walked in the room. It was like, is this a she? Is this a he? Do I hug them? Do I give them dap? Like, I don't know what to do. If people weren't cruel to me. People just didn't understand me, and it was humiliating. You know, so I had to step away from music journalism. So I took really intentional efforts to say, okay, how can I be myself in my queer body, in my trans body, and still make a living, and maybe still and be able to do it as a model of possibility for other people. So I made the intention to leave music and to work in media advocacy within the LGBT community so that I can be my fullest self and still have a career. But I think that's a lot of that is testament to the privileges I have to live in New York City, to be able to make it here, to have a family that loves me, that I did not have to stay in a place where I knew that I was not going to be considered valuable because of all of the layers that I may bring into the workplace. I'm happy to say now that the company that I'm working with and that I work for is very, very open. They look at diversity and inclusion as something that is a part of their leadership model, not something that's a distraction from it, and have really integrated that into their hiring process and how they develop the work. And I think that a lot of that is the reason that the company that I work for is so good like that. I think it's because it's female leadership. It's women who are in the positions of leadership and who are putting people over profits. And they understand that it's so important to have a diversity of perspectives, particularly as a group of facilitators and teachers who do leadership development. It's important to have a diversity of skill sets. So I haven't had a whole lot of issues with that because I've kind of had this bubble around me and have been able to make certain decisions. But what I do know is that is not everybody's story. And that so many people get stuck working in places where they have to just navigate this minefield of microaggressions every day because that's how they have to pay the bills. That's how they put food on the table. But with that, I say, if and when you do have to deal with that, what I think, before getting involved with any company, like learning what policies are in place, what protections are in place, who your HR people are, like what can be tolerated, what can't be. I think it's just so much extra thinking that we have to do as Black queer people before we step into many spaces, whether it be the classroom or the boardroom. So I've had to be really conscious about those things and decisions that would minimize microaggressions or macroaggressions.
Right. And I mean, speaking of those microaggressions, have been such an interesting driving force behind a lot of the data that we're seeing around communities of color and for communities that don't want to return back to the office. I mean, I'm remote for life. I don't know what the like thug symbol is for that, but that's what I'm doing. Yeah, you're not going to catch me having to tell people if I've cut my hair or not every week. So, but you know, now that we're sort of talking about how, and I, you know, I've worked with Noah before. For everyone who doesn't know, so I'm curious if any of you think that there are folks that and activists and influencers from history or present day that have made it easier to show up authentically for like have made it easier for you specifically to show up authentically in your careers as your Black queer selves.
Yeah, I think for me, I mean, this is a recent example, but I think it's just so important. When Laverne Cox was on Katie Couric's show, hey, Katie Couric, I'm sorry people see the clip if you haven't. Laverne and Carmen Carrera are on Katie Couric. Katie Couric wants to ask people about their body parts. Carmen Carrera is like, no. Laverne comes out, she tries the same thing. So what tell me about your bits? And Laverne was like, listen, when we start to have these conversations about people's, you know, bodies, we don't get into the actual lived experience of the people, right? So then Laverne goes on to talk about Eli Nettles, who was beaten to death in the street by these 5 guys who, when they spooked that she was a transgender woman, they beat her to death in Harlem, right? So she brings this up. The following week, Katie Couric calls me and calls my friend Chase and Laverne and has us back on the show. It has us on the show to actually talk about the lived experience of Black people. It was that of Black trans folks, and it was that moment that things really did start to shift around the conversation in mainstream media about the Black queer, Black trans experience, and people started to look for more Black and queer and trans creators to get behind the scenes. So that was one moment in media that really was a tipping point in the culture around kind of the cultural zeitgeist and kind of our consciousness around like the Black trans experience. And I think that was really, really helpful. So I know it's a recent example that was just 2014, but it had a big shift on my career as a media person and as a visible like leader and influencer in community.
So. Yeah, that was a really powerful moment. And I think that counts as history. 2014 was a pandemic ago deep. What are you thinking, Noah, in terms of like folks who have paved the way for you to show up authentically in your career?
You know, that's like a very interesting question to me, only because I can't point to any well-known transmasculine non-binary person in the media that everyone like with name recognition. There are people all over Instagram, influencers, YouTubers, TikTokers who are making their way. I'm not gonna say that there aren't, but that's a gap that's huge and glaring, and not just for like trans mass folks, for femme folks, for androgynous folks, for all of the non-binary genderqueer community, where I think that a lot of people are like not willing to even allow themselves to go there in terms of identity. I feel like a lot of times language is a huge thing. And the power of language is a huge thing. And actually, my own understanding of gender, I was a gender studies major, y'all. So this was my whole bread and butter while I was at USC. And I didn't know the term non-binary until I was searching on Tumblr, just going about on Tumblr, just doing my thing. And I remember someone had a long post saying they were non-binary. And I was like 25. And I was like, wait a second. This is a concept. Like, I might be this. This seems to make sense to me, but I couldn't point to any Black folks. I couldn't do it. I couldn't find anyone. And it was almost like an act of bravery for me to do it and step out and be like, I'm gonna do this, because it felt like such a white concept. So for me, I really want there to be more representation for non-binary, genderqueer, Black folks, because for me, I show up in the world, and I kind of talk about this in therapy of all places, but like people just see me and I pass as a man, but that's like not me for a lot of the time, and something that I don't particularly resonate with. So yeah, I want more. We talk about representation. Representation comes with cost. Representation isn't always perfect. But I would love to see more people out there just doing the thing, being who they are. Maybe one day I can be like something like that in fashion. We'll see. But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, Noah, it's 5:40 and you're gonna say things like you thought non-binary was a white concept and think that I'm gonna be able to move on from that? Oh. All right, okay. Let's put a pin in that, but we're gonna go back to that if we have time. Adia, what about you? How have how have or haven't people made it possible for you to show up as your authentic self in your career?
So kind of similar to Noah, I feel like there aren't many feminine lesbians that I can think of that have not been sexualized, or people who came out as bisexual. And I'm not saying that they weren't, but I'm specifically thinking of like Nicki Minaj because of my age and when I started listening to Nicki Minaj. When she first came out and like I was in middle school, a lot of girls were coming out as bi because Nicki was bi or was identifying as bi at the time. So being a lesbian, being feminine is interesting because I don't necessarily always feel like it's a respected identity. It's a fetish. So I can't really say that I have many people in mainstream media that I can even think of that have been that representation for me, which is why I'm like, well, it's good for me to feel a sense of community. I want to be around people who like love me. And so when I read this question, I honestly was like, I can't think of anyone other than my fiance's mother, who is like the mom from Mean Girls. And she's like incredibly supportive when I didn't have that support. Otherwise, she's always right there. I think she might actually be here right now. So yeah, I don't necessarily see that in the mainstream media. So I'm looking for it like from the people that are around me.
Well, I think it's become clear to me that, I mean, you've also brought up some shit as well, Adia, but I'll get back to that. I'll circle back. I want to touch on how we would compare our experiences. I know, it's not fair. It's not fair. But I'm curious to know if you think that in today's politicization of gender identity and the progress made on gender equality, if you think that it has mobilized Black queer folks to the same degree as their white queer counterparts. Yeah, that's what I want to know. What do you think, Noah?
Noah, to take the first stab at a question with politicalization. I can't even say, it's so long. Well, if I understand the question, Kristen, you're asking basically how Black folks have shown up versus how Black queer folks have shown up versus the overwhelming kind of visibility that white queer folks have had in showing up for themselves. Is that right? Or am I right in that? Great. I think people would want to be kind of pessimistic on this one, only because I think it comes from people's overwhelming experience of Black folks, and they would want that to trickle down into Black queer folks, maybe like having like internalized homophobia or internalized racism, and like really wanting Black people to not love themselves. But that hasn't been my experience from what I've seen. If anyone is more resilient and active about what is happening in their community, it's Black queer folks. I mean, 100%. Like, we show up for everybody, not just us. We're showing up for everybody. Actually, I mean, I was recently having a conversation with a friend who doesn't know a lot. And he was like, oh, like, what do you think about this and this? And I was like, kind of talking a little bit about how Bell Hooks and Audre Lorde talk a lot about how marginalized folks should be where things begin. We should kind of build the ground up from where those people are operating. Like they should cast the vision and we should start with them and kind of go upwards. And he was like, so who would that be? And I was like, Black trans women. And he was kind of like, what? Like, we should like let Black trans women like architect thought and like do all these things. And I was like, yes, we should, because they're the most marginalized groups in this country. And maybe it like, I don't want to make wide sweeping statements, but when it comes to marginalization in America, Black trans women are just there and being targeted and are being actively pursued in terms of legislation and violence and all of these things. So really what I think is a lot of people would want to think that wasn't the case, that Black folks aren't showing up for Black people. But in short, TLDR, Black queer folks are doing the thing for everybody. And the reason why gay marriage was changed, why the whole movement has been based on trans Black, Latinx and Black trans women pushing the way forward and kind of architecting vision and thought and power and movement that way. And then really letting that all it somehow gets the white folks first, which okay, but we really showing up for everybody, and there would be no progression in any queer movement without Black trans women, really, but folks in general.
I love it. I love it. Yes. Yes to everything you just said. What are you thinking, Adia? I want to ask you the same question before we jump to our last question and dive into some questions from the audience.
I'm not even sure that I can add anything after Noah. Like,
Right. Fair. I feel the same way most of the time after Noah speaks before me. So I think it's been clear to me that we need our hetero community, our Black hetero community, to include us in every decision made to build up our community. There shouldn't be queer Black initiatives and then Black initiatives. And I know that you see these in the DEI spaces at your jobs. These should be rather our Black initiatives. We should always ask, how does this build up our queer members of our community? Or does this help or hurt our queer members of our community? Before people decide to make a joke, send a tweet, or support a candidate, they should consider the impact on the queer Black community. And I'm curious how we can hold our hetero Black community accountable for that. I'm not going to say his name, but y'all know who I'm thinking about. It's not going to say his name.
You know, let me tell a quick story. I went to a comedy show the other night, right? The other day. And I'm sitting there and a comic on stage says, who here is parents? I raised my hand. I was like the only one to raise my hand. So, oh, you're a dad. He says, you know, back in the day, we only had to tell our kids about the birds and the bees. And now we got to tell them about gender identity and all this shit. What do you think? How are you going to tell your kid? I said, well, I'm trans. So there's that. He just gooped. He was just like, well, next joke. Now, I'm saying that to say what we need Black heterosexual folks to do is to know that we exist, right? And to start not to treat us as figments of your imagination, but people who are at your show, who are in your classrooms, who are in your bed, who are in your families, like we exist, and start to treat us like we exist. I think another thing that's really important, honestly, I think that leadership in the Black community, I think leadership in the world should be really left to women and Black queer people. I think if we want to see something different, let's do something different. If you do what you've always done, you're going to give what you always got. So how about like straight men just step aside a little bit, and like women and queer people really in positions of leadership, and in positions of decision making. And to Noah's point, like when we start to build around at those margins, when we center the margins, everybody is going to be involved. When it's us who are at the center of the conversations and building policies that are going to protect and uplift those most marginal of us, it will uplift and protect everybody subsequently. So I think that that's really important. But I think it's important for women and Black queer folks to really be in positions of leadership for a while and see what we can get from that.
Absolutely. I feel like I would love to tell white, straight, cis, hetero males to take a seat, but I know that they're already taking up all the seats at the table. So that's my joke of the day. But Adia, why don't you tell me what you think in terms of holding our like Black cis het community accountable for supporting candidates or their own ignorance or their own ability to you know, sort of explain away you know, misogyny and homophobic rhetoric.
Well, like Teague said, it's partially about them acknowledging that we exist, or not thinking that like to be queer is like associated with white culture. I had a friend say to me the other day, she didn't say this, but her she's African. Her father was talking about how like I guess how like being queer is like it's a white thing to him. Like I've heard that from a lot of people that that's where we get that from. Like it's the European influence on Black people, and that's why people are queer. And in that conversation, I was thinking about like how a lot of hetero people don't realize how much of queer history is Black history. Like I went to this session at my job that was called Queer History is Black History. I learned a lot of things, and I brought that up to my friend too, where I was like, you can see there's history of trans people in African tribes before anything was colonized. They just didn't use that term. And just like how many people in history identified as queer, and how like the Black community wouldn't have made the progress that we have made without queer people. So I think making sure that they understand like how that we've been here. And I don't know if that's where it needs to start, but we exist, we've been here, we're not going anywhere. And so to expect us to just like be a subculture has not been, that's not reality. It never has been, it never will be. So I think that's the biggest thing.
Absolutely. I love the idea of us not being a subculture. That feels, you know, like Noah, I'm not going to make another tasteless joke. I'm just going to pass the mic to you. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think one of the things we can do to hold us, our non-queer Black folks accountable, this is like gonna be really weird, but I came out to my mom over the summer. She knew I previously identified as a lesbian, and I came out to her as non-binary. She was fine with the lesbian thing, actually. When I came out to her a few years ago, she was just like, okay, yeah, I've known for like 2 years. And I was like, cool. And we were cool. But the non-binary thing was harder. One, because she doesn't have the language. My mom is like a 56-year-old Alabamian raised woman from the church. So she just doesn't know, y'all. She has no idea. So I came out to her, and I wrote a 5-page letter and I mailed it because I'm kind of a wimp. But she wrote back, and she was like, her first sentence was like, I cried when I got this letter only because you felt like you couldn't talk to me. And I think one of the ways we can really hold people accountable is by kind of giving them the benefit of like the doubt, or allowing them to make mistakes, allowing them to be informed, allowing them to kind of walk through the thought process themselves. Because I know specifically as queer trans folks, like we have to do so much of this unearthing, right? And like learning how to be ourselves and like determining who we are as people. And I think that a lot of straight folks have to do that too, in relationship to the people who are their loved ones. Like they have to figure out what that means. And they have to figure out what that means for their families, for themselves, and what it means to be in community. So that's my biggest thing. And that's a lesson that I've learned. I'm like, oh, I could talk to all the queer folks in the world. I could like chastise all the, I won't name folks either, all the people in the mainstream who don't understand us. But really, I think a lot of it has to be done in love and in education and allowing people to learn. That's so huge. Instead of writing off our community, instead of saying that we're hateful, instead of saying that the church won't allow us to love people, instead of all the nots, we need to come with some yes ands. So that's me.
Wow. I remember the story and it kind of makes me cry again. But you know, and it's so interesting how you said like your mother didn't have the language. And you know, I've said this so many times, but it's like language is always going to be behind the movement. And it's living and experiencing the movement that helps you define the language, but the language comes later, you know, and getting hung up on it can really, and I think that's what a lot of like, at least what my mom does, is like, I am so obsessed with making a fool out of myself. I couldn't possibly talk to your non-binary friend. And I'm like, Mom, this is ridiculous, right? So, yeah, let's start taking some questions from the audience. Would love, is somebody fielding them? I don't know, but you can ping me if you don't want to ask in front of everybody, just DM me and I will ask anonymously. I have more questions too, if you guys don't have any.
Keep going, K-Flex, keep going.
Okay, cool. So my one of my last questions is going to be, if the cookout is real, this is my fun question for you all, my closer. Which person who's impacted queer and Black culture from history or present day would absolutely, or from this call, would absolutely be your plus one?
Oh, I know.
Go for it, Noah.
This is easy. I'm taking James Baldwin with all his cigarettes. We're in Paris though, so it's not here. The cookout is not actually a cookout. We're at a bistro in Paris, because that's where he was a lot of the time.
It's like a
And
French cookout.
it's a French cookout, yes. But my person is James Baldwin, hands down. If you haven't read Giovanni's Room, please do yourselves a favor. Okay.
Thanks for the rec. Love it. Chief, what about you?
That's such a good question. I don't even know. Who would I invite to, to the cookout? It had to be somebody that's a lot of fun. I would say, I mean, I don't know if this person has had, I mean, I'm sure they've had an effect on Black queer culture. Sylvester, I think would have to be my plus one, just because we could dance and we could have a good time. We could have some drinks and we can kiki about it later. Sylvester would be my plus one.
Love that. What about you, Dia?
I'm gonna go with India Moore. And I know my fiance's mother is on the call, but it's because I have a crush. So it is what it is.
I love that. So I do have a question from the audience for Noah and or Teak. How did you start the process of coming out as trans or non-binary in your workspace? And what were some things you were afraid of?
Oh.
Yeah, so the thing about coming out is you have to do it in perpetuity. So it's just like a thing you constantly have to do. I recently started a job in November and I went through the entire process without mentioning it. And I was in a place of a very blessed position where I had like 4 offers. And I kind of tested every company by telling them that I was non-binary. And the company that I ended up choosing actually is very interesting. One of them was like a major news establishment, and they were kind of like, yeah, you're non-binary. We have tons of non-binary folks. It's fine. And I was like, okay. And the company that I chose, my manager actually was like, hey, I want to be open and transparent. I've never had someone that I've managed choose non-binary, but we want you. We want you to come and show up however you want. We want to celebrate you for who you are. And if you're non-binary, that's fine. She was like, how can I best represent you to the team? Was her question. And that was like really impactful for me, because like coming out was this daunting thing. And I've had to do it at every company I've been at in some weird way, but this was the best experience I ever had. And she was open and transparent about the fact that people would make mistakes. It was just such a human answer to coming out. I don't even remember the question, but that's my story.
Your story was the question, Noah. Kate, how did you start the process coming out as trans, if you have, in your workplace, or, well, of course you have, you're writing a book. But go for it.
Yeah. You know what I did? The way I did it was when I moved to New York, I moved here to the city on purpose because I knew that there was resources and community here, and I was working in music, and that wasn't working. So I worked in the LGBTQ community on purpose. So I was at the Hedrick Martin Institute, I was at the Bronx Community Pride Center, I was at GLAAD, I was working at all of these different organizations. I was at Lambda Legal while I was transitioning because I knew that I could transition there in a way that felt okay. In a way that I was supported. So that's how I did it. And then the work I do now, it's not an LGBTQ organization, but they knew of me from the work that I've done in the world when I came on board. And again, they looked at my experiences as a Black queer trans person as an asset to the work that I do. So they valued that. I don't feel othered. It's not like, oh, this is Black queer person that works here. It's like, no, we got Black queer people working because it's important. It's important that we have a different perspectives and different skill sets in the type of work that we do. So that's how that's worked for me. So it was very intentional, very deliberate how I did that.
Thank you. Okay, do we have any other questions? I want to be mindful of our panelist schedule. It is 6:01. Black History Month will commence soon, but you can also join me in taking the first 2 days of Women's History Month to be Black too. All right, Kenny, do you want to, oh, here we go. We have another, this is a question. Perfect. All right, Kenny, do you want to bring us home?
Yeah. So I'd just like to once again thank everyone for being here this evening and sharing this space in the Rose Garden. It got really real in the Rose Garden, as always, when we do these events. So definitely shout out to the entire Black History Month team for really putting this together. Y'all are fire. It's always a pleasure to kind of ride this out with y'all and just play the background. I don't even have to really like do much. I just like pop in and say, what's up, y'all? What's happening? Can we do this? Oh, okay, cool. All right, I'm gonna shut up. Once again, welcome back to Noah, to being a part of the Rose Garden, but definitely Teak and Adia. I know you have many names. I apologize, but we also welcome y'all to the Rose Garden and just being here, because one thing that I was thinking about throughout this entire conversation, I know people talk about safe spaces, but I think one thing that the Roses bring, we bring brave spaces, because we bring the bravest motherfuckers we possibly know on this planet. And I call y'all motherfuckers in the most sentimental way possible. So don't take, I call everybody a motherfucker. So, but I really appreciate y'all just being here in this space and having us close Black History Month on a really, really strong point. And we're going to continue to create these brave spaces for people like us, and people that love like us, and people that share like us, and people that want to grow like us at the end of the day. So I just want to close out the night on that point. We're going to see you all on the next joint that we do. It's a busy week for the organization, but thank y'all for being here. Once again, I can't thank y'all enough. Give it up for the hostess with the mostest, of course, K Flex, also known as Kristen. She always kills it for us every single time. But once again, it's a team effort. So shout out to the entire team. And everybody have a great and good night. And please stay safe out there, because it's a little wild. All right. Take care. God
Thank
bless.
you so
Peace.
much.
Thank you. Stop the recording.